Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias' stories. We now return to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, Part 2, Chapter 13, The Iceberg. The Nautilus was steadily pursuing its southerly course, following the 50th meridian with considerable speed. Did he wish to reach the pole? I do not think so, for every attempt to reach that point had, hitherto, failed. Again, the season was far advanced, for in the Antarctic regions the 13th of March corresponds with the 30th of September of northern regions, which begin at the equinoctial season. On the 14th of March, I saw floating ice in latitude 55 degrees, merely pale bits of debris from 20 to 25 feet long, forming banks over which the sea curled. The Nautilus remained on the surface of the ocean. Ned Land, who had fished in the Arctic seas, was familiar with its icebergs, but Conseil and I admired them for the first time. In the atmosphere towards the southern horizon stretched a white, dazzling band. English whalers have given it the name of ice blink. However thick the clouds may be, it is always visible and announces the presence of an ice pack or a bank. Accordingly, larger blocks soon appeared, whose brilliancy changed with the caprices of the fog. Some of these masses showed green veins, as if long undulating lines had been traced with sulfate of copper. Others resembled enormous amethysts, with the light shining through them. Some reflected the light of day upon 1,000 crystal facets. Others, shaded with vivid calcareous reflections, resembled the perfect town of marble. The more we neared the south, the more these floating islands increased both in number and importance. At 60 degrees latitude, every pass had disappeared. But seeking carefully, Captain Nemo soon found a narrow opening, through which he boldly slipped, knowing, however, that it would close behind him. Thus, guided by this clever hand, the Nautilus passed through all the ice with a precision which quite charmed Conseil. Icebergs or mountains, ice fields or smooth plains, seeming to have no limits, drift ice or floating ice packs, plains broken up, called palts when they are circular, and streams when they are made up of long strips. The temperature was very low. The thermometer exposed to the air marked 2 degrees or 3 degrees below zero. But we were warmly clad with fur at the expense of the sea bear and seal. The interior of the Nautilus, warmed regularly by its electric apparatus, defied by the most intense cold. Besides, it would only have been necessary to go some yards beneath the waves to find a more bearable temperature. 2 months earlier, we should have had perpetual daylight in these latitudes, but already we had had 3 or 4 hours of night, and by there would be 6 months of darkness in these circumpolar regions. On the 15th of March, we were in the latitude of New Shetland and South Orkney. The captain told me that formerly numerous tribes of seals inhabited them, but that English and American whalers, in their rage for destruction, massacred both old and young. Thus, where there was once life and animation, they had left silence and death. About 8 o'clock in the morning of the 6th of March, the Nautilus, following the 55th meridian, cut the Antarctic polar icicle. Cut the Antarctic polar circle. Ice surrounded us on all sides and closed the horizon. But Captain Nemo went from one opening to another, still going higher. I cannot express my astonishment at the beauties of these new regions. The ice took most surprising forms. Here, the grouping formed an oriental town with innumerable mosques and minarets. There, a fallen city thrown to the earth, as it were, by some convulsion of nature. The whole aspect was constantly changed by the oblique rays of the sun, or lost in the greyish fog amidst hurricanes of snow. Detonations and falls were heard on all sides, great overthrows of icebergs which altered the whole landscape like diorama. Often seeing no exit, I thought we were definitely prisoners. But instinct guiding him at the slightest indication, Captain Nemo would discover a new path. He was never mistaken when he saw the thin threads of bluish water trickling along the ice fields, and I had no doubt that he had already ventured into the midst of these Antarctic seas before. On the 6th of March, however, the ice fields absolutely blocked our road. It was not the iceberg itself as yet, but vast fields cemented by the cold. But this obstacle could not stop Captain Nemo. He hurled himself against it with frightful violence. The Nautilus entered the brittle mass like a wedge and split it with frightful crackings. It was the battering ram of the ancients, hurled by infinite strength. The ice, thrown high in the air, fell like hail around us. But its own power of impulsion, our apparatus, made a canal for itself. Sometimes carried away by its own impetus, it lodged on the ice fields, crushing it with its weight, and sometimes buried beneath it, dividing it by a simple pitching movement, producing large rents in it. Violent gales assailed us at this time, accompanied by thick fogs, through which, from one end of the platform to the other, we could see nothing. The wind blew sharply from all parts of the compass, and the snow lay in such hard heaps that we had to break it with blows of a pickaxe. The temperature was always at 5 degrees below zero. Every outward part of the Nautilus was covered with ice. A rigged vessel would have been entangled in the blocked-up gorges. A vessel without sails, with electricity for its motive power, and wanting no coal, could alone brave such high latitudes. At length, on the 18th of March, after many useless assaults, the Nautilus was positively blocked. It was no longer either streams, packs, or ice fields, but an interminable and immovable barrier formed by mountains soldered together. "On Iceberg," said the Canadian to me. I knew that to Ned Land, as well as to all other navigators who had preceded us, this was an inevitable obstacle. The sun appearing for an instant at noon, Captain Nemo took an observation as near as possible, which gave our situation at 51 degrees 30 minutes longitude and 67 degrees 39 minutes of south latitude. We had advanced 1 degree more in this Antarctic region. Of the liquid surface of the sea there was no longer a glimpse. Under the spur of the Nautilus lay stretched a vast plain entangled with confused blocks. Here and there, sharp points and slender needles rising to a height of 200 feet. Further on a steep shore, hewn as it were with an axe and clothed with greyish tints, huge mirrors reflecting a few rays of sunshine half drowned in the fog. and over this desolate face of nature a stern silence reigned, scarcely broken by the flapping of the wings of petrels and puffins. Everything was frozen, even the noise. The Nautilus was then obliged to stop in its adventurous course amid these fields of ice. In spite of our efforts, in spite of the powerful means employed to break up the ice, the Nautilus remained immovable. Generally, when we can proceed no further, we have return still open to us. But here, return was impossible as advance, for every pass had closed behind us, and for the few moments when we were stationary, we were likely to be entirely blocked, which did indeed happen about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The fresh ice forming around its sides with astonishing rapidity. I was obliged to admit that Captain Nemo was more than imprudent. I was on the platform at that moment. The captain had been observing our situation for some time past, when he said to me, "Well, sir, what do you think of this?" "I think that we are caught, Captain." "So, Monsieur Aronnaud, you really think that the Nautilus cannot disengage itself?" "With difficulty, Captain, for the season is already too far advanced for you to reckon on the breaking of the ice." "Ah, sir," said Captain Nemo, in an ironical tone, "you will always be the same. You see nothing but difficulties and obstacles. I affirm that not only can the Nautilus disengage itself, but also that it can go further still." "Further to the south?" I asked, looking at the captain. "Yes, sir. It shall go to the pole." "To the pole?" I exclaimed, unable to repress a gesture of incredulity. "Yes," replied the captain coldly, "to the Antarctic pole, to that unknown point from whence springs every meridian of the globe. You know whether I can do as I please with the Nautilus." Yes, I knew that. I knew that this man was bold, even to rashness. But to conquer those obstacles which bristled round the South Pole, rendering it more inaccessible than the North, which had not yet been reached by the boldest of navigators, was it not a mad enterprise, which only a maniac would have conceived? It then came into my head to ask Captain Nemo if he had ever discovered that pole which had never yet been trodden by a human creature. "No, sir," he replied, "but we will discover it together. Where others have failed, I will not fail. I have never yet led my Nautilus so far into southern seas, but, I repeat, it shall go further yet." "I can well believe you, Captain," said I, in a slightly ironical tone. "I believe you. Let us go ahead. There are no obstacles for us. Let us smash this iceberg. Let us blow it up. And if it resists, let us give the Nautilus wings to fly over it." "Over it, sir," said Captain Nemo quietly. "No, not over it, but under it." "Under it?" I exclaimed, a sudden idea of the captain's projects flashing upon my mind. I understood. The wonderful qualities of the Nautilus were going to serve us in this superhuman enterprise. "I see we are beginning to understand one another, sir," said the captain, half smiling. "You begin to see the possibility, I should say the success of this attempt. That which is impossible for an ordinary vessel is easy to the Nautilus. If a continent lies before the pole, it must stop before the continent. But if, On the contrary, the pole is washed by open sea. It will go even to the pole." "Certainly," said I, carried away by the captain's reasoning. "If the surface of the sea is solidified by the ice, the lower depths are free by the providential law which has placed the maximum of density of the waters of the ocean 1 degree higher than freezing point. And if I am not mistaken, the portion of this iceberg which is above the water is as 1:4 to what which is below." "Very nearly, sir. For 1 foot of iceberg above the sea, there are 3 below it. If these ice mountains are not more than 300 feet above the surface, they are not more than 900 beneath. And what are 900 feet to the Nautilus? Nothing, sir. It could even seek at greater depths that uniform temperature of sea water, and there brave with impunity the 30 or 40 degrees of surface cold." "Just so, sir, just so," I replied, getting animated. "The only difficulty," continued Captain Nemo, "is that of remaining several days without renewing our provision of air." "Is that all? The Nautilus has vast reservoirs. We can fill them, and they will supply us with all the oxygen we want." "Well thought of, Monsieur Aronnaud," replied the captain, smiling. "But not wishing you to accuse me of rashness, I will first give you all my objections." "Have you any more to make?" "Only one. It is possible. If the sea exists at the South Pole, it may be covered, and consequently we shall be unable to come to the surface." "Good, sir. But do you forget that the Nautilus is armed with a powerful spur, and could we not send it diagonally against these fields of ice, which would open at the shocks?" "Ah, sir, you are full of ideas today. Besides, Captain," I added enthusiastically, "why should we not find the sea open at the South Pole as well as the North? The frozen poles of the earth do not coincide, either in the southern or in the northern regions, and until it is proved to the contrary, we may suppose either a continent or an ocean free from ice at these 2 points of the globe." "I think so too, Monsieur Aronnaud," replied Captain Nemo. "I only wish you to observe that after having made so many objections to my project, you are now crushing me with arguments in its favor." The preparations for this audacious attempt now began. The powerful pumps of the Nautilus were working air into the reservoirs and storing it at high pressure. About 4 o'clock, Captain Nemo announced the closing of the panels on the platform. I threw one last look at the massive iceberg which we were going to cross. The weather was clear, the atmosphere pure enough, the cold very great, being 12 degrees below zero, but the wind having gone down. This temperature was not so unbearable. About 10 men mounted the side of the Nautilus. About 10 men mounted the sides of the Nautilus, armed with pickaxes to break the ice around the vessel, which was soon free. The operation was quickly performed, for the fresh ice was still very thin. We all went below. The usual reservoirs were filled with the newly liberated water, and the Nautilus soon descended. I had taken my place with Conseil in the saloon. Through the open window we could see the lower beds of the Southern Ocean. The thermometer went up. The needle of the compass deviated on the dial at about 900 feet, as Captain Nemo had foreseen. We were floating beneath the undulating bottom of the iceberg, but the Nautilus went lower still. It went to the depth of 400 fathoms. The temperature of the water at the surface showed 12 degrees. It was now only 10. We had gained 2. I need not say the temperature of the Nautilus was raised by its heating apparatus to a much higher degree. Every maneuver was accomplished with wonderful precision. "We shall pass it, if you please, sir," said Conseil. "I believe we shall," I said in a tone of firm conviction. In the open sea, the Nautilus had taken its course direct to the pole, without leaving the 52nd meridian. From 67 degrees 30 minutes to 90 degrees 22 degrees and a half of latitude remained to travel. That is about 500 leagues. The Nautilus kept up a mean speed of 26 miles an hour, the speed of an express train. If that was kept up, in 40 hours we should reach the pole. For a part of the night, the novelty of the situation kept us at the window. The sea was lit with the electric lantern, but it was deserted. Fishes did not sojourn in these imprisoned waters. They only found there a passage to take them from the Antarctic Ocean to the open polar sea. Our pace was rapid. We could feel it by the quivering of the long steel body. About 2 a.m, I took some hours' repose. And Conseil did the same. In crossing the waist, I did not meet Captain Nemo. I supposed him to be in the pilot's cage. The next morning, the 19th of March, I took my post once more in the saloon. The electric log told me that the speed of the Nautilus had been slackened. It was then going towards the surface, but prudently emptying its reservoirs very slowly. My heart beat fast. We were going to emerge and regain the open polar atmosphere? No! A shock told me that the Nautilus had struck the bottom of the iceberg. Still very thick, judging from the deadened sound, we had indeed struck, to use a sea expression, but in an inverse sense, and at 1,000 feet deep. This would give 3,000 feet of iceberg above us, 1,000 being above the water mark. The iceberg was then higher than at its borders. Not a very reassuring fact. Several times that day the Nautilus tried again, and every time it struck the wall which lay like a ceiling above it. Sometimes it met with but 900 yards, only 200 of which rose above the surface. It was twice the height. It was when the Nautilus had gone under the waves. I carefully noted the different depths, and thus obtained a submarine profile of the chain as it was developed under the water. That night, no change had taken place in our situation. Still, ice being 400 and 500 yards in depth, it was evidently diminishing. But still, what a thickness between us and the surface of the ocean! It was then 8. According to the daily custom on board the Nautilus, its air should have been renewed 4 hours ago, but I did not suffer much, although Captain Nemo had not yet made any demand upon his reserve of oxygen. My sleep was painful that night. Hope and fear besieged me by turns. I rose several times. The groping of the Nautilus continued. About 3 a.m, I noticed that the lower surface of the iceberg was only about 50 feet deep. 150 feet now separated us from the surface of the waters. The iceberg was by degrees becoming an ice field, the mountain a plain. My eyes never felt the manometer. We were still rising diagonally to the surface, which sparkled under the electric rays. The iceberg was stretching both above and beneath into lengthening slopes. Mile after mile it was getting thinner. At length, at 6 a.m. of that memorable day, the 19th of March, the door of the saloon opened, and Captain Nemo appeared. "The sea is open," was all he said. Chapter 14. The South Pole. I rushed on to the platform. Yes, the open sea, with but a few scattered pieces of ice and moving icebergs. A long stretch of sea, a world of birds in the air, and myriads of fishes under those waters, which varied from intense blue to olive green according to the bottom. The thermometer marked 3 degrees Celsius above zero. It was comparatively spring. Shut up as we were behind this iceberg, whose lengthened mass was dimly seen on our northern horizons. "Are we at the pole?" I asked the captain, with a beating heart. "I do not know," he replied. "At noon I will take our bearings." "But will the sun show himself through this fog?" said I, looking at the leaden sky. "However little it shows, it will be enough," replied the captain. About 10 miles south, a solitary island rose to a height of 104 yards. We made for it, but carefully, for the sea might be strewn with banks. 1 hour afterwards, we had reached it. 2 hours later, we had made the round of it. It measured 4 or 5 miles in circumference. A narrow canal separated it from a considerable stretch of land, perhaps a continent, for we could not see its limits. The existence of this land seemed to give some color to Maury's theory. The ingenious American has remarked that between the South Pole and the 60th parallel, the sea is covered with floating ice of enormous size, which is never met with in the North Atlantic. From this fact, he has drawn the conclusion that the Antarctic Circle encloses considerable continents, as icebergs cannot form in open sea, but only on the coasts. According to these calculations, the mass of ice surrounding the southern pole forms a vast cap, the circumference of which must be at least 2,500 miles. But the Nautilus, for fear of running aground, had stopped about 3 cable lengths from a strand over which reared a superb heap of rocks. The boat was launched. The captain, 2 of his men bearing instruments, Conseil and myself were in it. It was 10 in the morning. I had not seen Ned Land. Doubtless the Canadian did not wish to admit the presence of the South Pole. A few strokes of the oar brought us to the sand, where we ran ashore. Conseil was going to jump onto the land when I held him back. "Sir," I said to Captain Nemo, to you belongs the honor of first setting foot on this land." "Yes, sir," said the captain, "and if I do not hesitate to tread this South Pole, it is because up to this time no human being has left a trace there." Saying this, he jumped lightly onto the sand. His heart beat with emotion. He climbed the rock, sloping to a little promontory, and there, with his arms crossed, mute and motionless, and with an eager look, he seemed to take possession of these southern regions. After 5 minutes passed in this ecstasy, he returned to us. "When you like, sir." I landed, followed by Conseil, leaving the 2 men in the boat. For a long way the soil was composed of a reddish sandy stone, something like crushed brick, scoriae, streams of lava, and pumice stones. One could not mistake its volcanic origin. In some parts, slight curls of smoke emitted a sulfurious smell, proving that the internal fires had lost nothing of their expansive powers, though, having climbed a high acclivity, I could see no volcano for a radius of several miles. We know that in those Antarctic countries, James Ross found 2 craters, the Erebus and Terror, in full activity. On the 167th meridian, latitude 77 degrees 32 minutes, the vegetation of this desolate continent seemed to me much restricted. Some lichens lay upon the black rocks, some microscopic plants, rudimentary diatomas, a kind of cells placed between 2 quartz shells. Long purple and scarlet weed supported on little swimming bladders which the breaking of the waves brought to the shore. These constituted the meager flora of this region. The shore was strewn with mollusks, little mussels and limpets. I also saw myriads of northern cleos, 1¼ inches long, of which a whale would swallow a whole world at a mouthful, and some perfect sea butterflies, animating the waters on the skirts of the shore. There appeared on the high bottom some coral shrubs, of the kind which, according to James Ross, lived in the Antarctic seas to the depth of more than 1,000 yards. Then there were little kingfishers and starfish studying the soil, but where life abounded most was in the air. There thousands of birds fluttered and flew of all kinds, deafening us with their cries. Others crowded the rock, looking at us as we passed by without fear, and pressing familiarly close by our feet. There were penguins, so agile in the water, heavy and awkward as they are on the ground. They were uttering harsh cries, a large assembly, sober in gesture, but extravagant in clamor. Albatrosses passing in the air, the expanse of their wings being at least 4.5 yards, and justly called the vultures of the ocean. Some gigantic petrels and some damiers, a kind of small duck, the under part of whose body is black and white. Then there were a whole series of petrels, some whitish with brown bordered wings, others blue peculiar to the Antarctic seas, and so oily, as I told Conseil, that the inhabitants of the Faroe Islands had nothing to do before lighting them but to put a wick in. "A little more," said Conseil, "and they would be perfect lamps. After that, we cannot expect nature to have previously furnished them with wicks." About 1/2 mile further on, the soil was riddled with ruffs' nests, a sort of laying ground, out of which many birds were issuing. Captain Nemo had some hundreds hunted. They uttered a cry like the braying of an ass, were about the size of a goose, slate color on the body, white beneath, with a yellow line round their throats. They allowed themselves to be killed with a stone, never trying to escape. But the fog did not lift, and at 11 the sun had not yet shown itself. Its absence made me uneasy. Without it, no observations were possible. How then could we decide whether we had reached the pole? When I rejoined Captain Nemo, I found him leaning on a piece of rock, silently watching the sky. He seemed impatient and vexed. But what was to be done? This rash and powerful man could not command the sun as he did the sea. Noon arrived without the orb of day showing itself for an instant. We could not even tell its position behind the curtain of fog, and soon the fog turned to snow. "Till tomorrow," said the captain quietly, and we returned to the Nautilus amid these atmospheric disturbances. The tempest of snow continued till the next day. It was impossible to remain on the platform. From the saloon, where I was taking notes of incidents happening during this excursion to the polar continent, I could hear the midst of this violent storm. The Nautilus did not remain motionless, but skirted the coast, advancing 10 miles more to the south in the half-light left by the sun as it skirted the edge of the horizon. The next day, the 20th of March, the snow had ceased. The cold was a little greater, the thermometer showing 2 degrees below zero. The fog was rising, and I hoped that that day our observations might be taken. Captain Nemo had not having yet appeared, the boat took Conseil and myself to land. The soil was still of the same volcanic nature. Everywhere were traces of lava, scoria, and basalt, but the crater which had vomited them I could not see. Here, as lower down, this continent was alive with myriads of birds, but their rule was now divided with larger troops of sea mammals, looking at us with their soft eyes. There were several kinds of seals, some stretched on the earth, some on flakes of ice, many going in and out of the sea. They did not flee at our approach, never having had anything to do with man, and I reckon that there were provisions there for hundreds of vessels. "Sir," said Conseil, "will you tell me the names of these creatures?" "They are seals and morses." It was now 8 in the morning. 4 hours remained to us before the sun could be observed with advantage. I directed our steps towards a vast bay cut in the steep granite shore. There I can aver that earth and ice were lost to sight by the numbers of sea mammals covering them, and I involuntarily sought for old Proteus, the mythological shepherd who watched these immense flocks of Neptune. There were more seals than anything else, forming distinct groups, male and female, the father watching over his family, the mother suckling her little ones, some already strong enough to go a few steps. When they wished to change their place, they took little jumps made by the contraction of their bodies, and held awkwardly enough by their imperfect fin, which, as with the lamantine, their cousins, forms a perfect forearm. I should say that in the water, which is their element, the spine of these creatures is flexible, with smooth and close skin and webbed feet. They swim admirably. In resting on the earth, they take the most graceful attitudes. Thus the ancients, observing their soft and expressive looks, which cannot be surpassed by the most beautiful look a woman can give, their clear, voluptuous eyes, their charming positions, and the poetry of their manners, metamorphosed them, the male into a triton and the female into a mermaid. I made Conseil notice the considerable development of the lobes of the brain in these interesting cetaceans. No mammal except man has such a quantity of brain matter. They are also capable of receiving a certain amount of education, are easily domesticated, and I think with other naturalists that if properly taught, they would be of great service as fishing dogs. The greater part of them slept on the rocks or on the sand. Amongst these seals, properly so called, which have no external ears, in which they differ from the otter, whose ears are prominent, I noticed several varieties of seal about 3 yards long, with a white coat, bulldog heads, armed with teeth in both jaws, 4 incisors at the top and 4 at the bottom, and 2 large canine teeth in the shape of a fleur de lis. Amongst them glided sea elephants, a kind of seal with short, flexible trunks. The giants of this species measured 20 feet round and 10 yards and a half in length, but they did not move as we approached. "These creatures are not dangerous?" asked Conseil. "No, not unless you attack them. When they have to defend their young, their rage is terrible, and it is not uncommon for them to break the fishing boats to pieces." "You are quite right," said Conseil. "I do not say they are not." 2 miles further on, we were stopped by the promontory which shelters the bay from the southerly winds. Beyond it we heard loud bellowing, such as a troop of ruminants would produce. "Good!" said Conseil. "A concert of bulls!" "No, a concert of morses. They are fighting! They are either fighting or playing." We now began to climb the blackish rocks amid unforeseen stumbles and over stones which the ice made slippery. More than once I rolled over at the expense of my loins. Conseil, more prudent or more steady, did not stumble and held me up, saying, "If, sir, you would have the kindness to take wider steps, you would preserve your equilibrium better." Arrived at the upper ridge of the promontory, I saw a vast white plain covered with morses. They were playing amongst themselves, and what we heard were bellowings of pleasure, not of anger. As I passed these curious animals, I could examine them leisurely, for they did not move. Their skin were thick and rugged, of a yellowish tint approaching to the red. Their hair was short and scant. Some of them were 4 yards and a quarter long. quieter and less timid than their cousins of the north, they did not, like them, place sentinels round the outskirts of their encampment. After examining this city of Moses, I began to think of returning. It was 11 o'clock, and if Captain Nemo found the conditions favorable for observations, I wished to be present at the operation. We followed the narrow pathway running along the summit of the steep shore. At 11:30, we had reached the place where we landed. The boat had run aground, bringing the captain. I saw him standing on a block of basalt, his instruments near him, his eyes fixed on the northern horizon, near which the sun was then describing a lengthened curve. I took my place beside him and waited without speaking. Noon arrived, and as before, the sun did not appear. It was a fatality. Observations were still wanting. If not accomplished tomorrow, we must give up all idea of taking any. We were indeed exactly at the 20th of March. Tomorrow, the 21st, would be the equinox. The sun would disappear behind the horizon for 6 months, and with its disappearance, the long polar night would begin. Since the September equinox, it had merged from the northern horizon, rising by lengthened spirals up to the 21st of December. At this period, the summer solstice of the northern regions, it had begun to descend, and tomorrow was to shed its last rays upon them. I communicated my fears and observations to Captain Nemo. "You are right, Monsieur Aronnaud," said he. "If tomorrow I cannot take the altitude of the sun, I shall not be able to do it for 6 months. But precisely because chance has led me into these seas on the 21st of March, my bearings will be easy to take if at 12 we can see the sun." "Why, Captain? Pourquoi?" "Because then the orb of day described such lengthened curves that it is difficult to measure exactly its height above the horizon, and grave errors may be made with instruments." "What will you do then?" "I shall only use my chronometer," replied Captain Nemo. "If tomorrow, the 21st of March, the disk of the sun, allowing for refraction, is exactly cut by the northern horizon, it will show that I am at the South Pole." "Just so," said I, "but this statement is not mathematically correct, because the equinox does not necessarily begin at noon." "Very likely, sir, but the error will not be 100 yards, and we do not want more. Till tomorrow, then." Captain Nemo returned on board. Conseil and I remained to survey the shore, observing and studying until 5 o'clock. Then I went to bed. Not, however, without invoking, like the Indian, the favor of the radiant orb. The next day, the 21st of March, at 5 in the morning, I mounted the platform. I found Captain Nemo there. "The weather is lightening a little," said he. "I have some hope. After breakfast, we will go on shore and choose a post for observation." That point settled, I sought Ned Land. I wanted to take him with me, but the obstinate Canadian refused, and I saw that his taciturnity,
Taciturnity.
taciturn, of a person reserved or uncommunicative in speech, saying little. But the obstinate Canadian refused, and I saw that his taciturnity and his bad humor grew day by day. After all, I was not sorry for his obstinacy under the circumstances. Indeed, there were too many seals on shore, and we ought not to lay such temptation in this unreflecting fisherman's way. Breakfast over, we went on shore. The Nautilus had gone some miles further up in the night. It was a whole league from the coast, above which reared a sharp peak about 500 yards high. The boat took with me Captain Nemo, 2 men of the crew, and the instruments, which consisted of a chronometer, a telescope, and a barometer.
While crossing, I saw numerous whales belonging to the three kinds peculiar to the southern seas: the whale or the English right whale, which has no dorsal fin; the humpback, which with reeved chest and large whitish fins, which in spite of its name do not form wings; and the finback of a yellowish brown, the liveliest of all the cetacea. This powerful creature is heard a long way off when he throws to a great height columns of air and vapor, which look like whirlwinds of smoke. These different mammals were disporting themselves in troops in the quiet waters, and I could see that this basin of the Antarctic pole serves as a place of refuge to the cetacea too closely tracked by the hunters. I also noticed large medusae floating between the reeds. At 9 we landed. The sky was brightening, the clouds were flying to the south, and the fog seemed to be leaving the cold surface of the waters. Captain Nemo went towards the peak, which he doubtless meant to be his observatory. It was a painful ascent over the sharp lava and the pumice stones, in an atmosphere often impregnated with a sulphurous smell from the smoking cracks. For a man unaccustomed to walk on land, the captain climbed the steep slopes with an agility I never saw equaled and which a hunter would have envied. We were 2 hours getting to the summit of this peak, which was half porphyry, and half basalt. Porphyry, a hard, ingenious rock containing crystals, usually of feldspar, in a fine-grained, typically reddish ground mass. Porphyry. And half basalt. From thence we looked upon a vast sea which towards the north distinctly traced its boundary line upon the sky. At our feet lay fields of dazzling whiteness. Over our heads a pale azure, free from fog. To the north the disk of the sun seemed like a ball of fire, already horned by the cutting of the horizon. From the bosom of the water rose sheaves of liquid jets by hundreds. In the distance lay the Nautilus like a cetacean asleep in the water. Behind us, to the south and east, an immense country and a chaotic heap of rocks and ice, the limits of which were not visible. On arriving at the summit, Captain Nemo carefully took the mean height of the barometer, for he would have to consider that in taking his observations. At 11:45, the sun, then seen only by refraction, looked like a golden disk, shedding its last rays upon this deserted continent and seas which never man had yet plowed. Captain Nemo, furnished with a lenticular glass which, by means of a mirror, corrected the refraction, watched the orb sinking below the horizon by degrees, following a lengthened diagonal. I held the chronometer. My heart beat fast. If the disappearance of the half-disk of the sun coincided with 12 o'clock on the chronometer, we were at the pole itself. 12! I exclaimed. The South Pole, replied Captain Nemo in a grave voice, handing me the glass, which showed the orb cut in exactly equal parts by the horizon. I looked at the last rays crowning the peak and the shadows mounting by degrees up its slopes. At that moment, Captain Nemo, resting with his hand on my shoulder, said, "I, Captain Nemo, on this 21st day of March, 1868, have reached the South Pole on the 90th degree. And I take possession of this part of the globe equal to 1/6 of the known continent." "In whose name, Captain?" "In my own, sir." Saying which, Captain Nemo unfurled a black banner bearing an N in gold quartered on its bunting. Then turning towards the orb of day, whose last rays lapped the horizon of the sea, he exclaimed, "Adieu, sun! Disappear, thou radiant orb, rest beneath this open sea, and let a night of 6 months spread its shadows over my new domains.